You are a young warrior from Tlaxcalan, 19 years old. Strong enough to have taken 4 captives in battle. The year is 157. You stand bound on the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, heart pounding beneath obsidian blades. The sun is rising. Below you, 70,000 Aztecs fill the sacred precinct, their faces painted black and red. You can smell the copal incense, and the blood from yesterday's sacrifice is still drying on the stone. The priest in the feathered jaguar costume lifts your chin so the crowd can see your face. You are not going to die quickly. This is not a battlefield death. This is the opening ceremony of a ritual that will last 4 days and end with your heart burning in a brazier while your body feeds the empire that destroyed your city. This is not a horror story. This was Tuesday in the Aztec world. What I'm about to show you is the part of Mesoamerican history they softened in textbooks and museums. The industrial-scale human sacrifice machine that consumed tens of thousands of captives every year. This isn't exaggeration. It's documented by the Aztecs themselves, in their own codices, confirmed by Spanish eyewitnesses, and proven by the mountains of skulls archaeologists keep finding. If you stay until the end, you will never look at those beautiful feathered headdresses the same way again. Hollywood gave you temples and gold. What they never showed you was the conveyor belt of living hearts that kept the Aztec universe turning. The Aztecs didn't just sacrifice people, they built an entire civilization around the systematic harvesting of human blood and hearts. Modern historians struggle for words, some call it ritualized violence on an industrial scale, but the Aztecs themselves had a simple term, the debt payment. They believed the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and humanity owed endless blood in return. Before we climb those pyramid steps, I need you to do something right now. Smash the like button if you believe the truth of history should be told, even when it's covered in blood. Then comment the word Tenochtitlan so I know you're still with me. Because this story isn't about ancient religion, it's about what a society becomes when it decides mass murder is the foundation of everything. Now, let's walk up the stairs you will never come down. The process began long before the knife touched your chest. Captives like you were not random prisoners. You were carefully selected products of the Flower Wars fought not for territory, but specifically to take high-quality captives alive. The Aztecs and their enemies had an agreement: no killing the nobles, no poisoning arrows, no destroying cities. The goal was to deliver healthy, strong warriors to the altar. Spanish chronicler Diego Duran wrote that these wars were scheduled like sporting events. Rulers sent invitations. We will meet at such and such plain on the new moon to provide captives for Huitzilopochtli. Thousands of warriors would clash in choreographed battles, trying to loop ropes around necks instead of crushing skulls. If you were taken, the journey to Tenochtitlan was designed to break your spirit before the gods even saw you. You were marched hundreds of miles, in lines of hundreds, your hair tied to a long pole so you couldn't run. Your captor walked behind you. His status in Aztec society now depended on delivering you alive and unspoiled. If you collapsed from exhaustion, he lost everything. Bernardino de Sahagún's native informants described captives being force-fed pulque and chili to keep them docile, their legs painted white and sprinkled with feathers to mark them as sacred offerings. When you arrived at the lake city, the spectacle began. You were paraded through the avenues, while crowds pelted you with flowers and insults. Nobles inspected you like livestock. The best-looking, strongest captives were reserved for the major festivals. The rest were distributed to smaller temples across the empire. Every neighborhood had its own skull rack. Then came the fattening. For weeks or months, prime captives were kept in wooden cages called tzompantli houses. You were fed richly tamales, chocolate, turkey to make you strong for the god. Some were given wives, young women trained to pamper you, so your final days would be filled with pleasure and confusion. The Aztecs believed a willing, happy victim produced better blood. Spanish friars recorded stories of captives who converted to the Aztec faith, begging to be sacrificed as an honor. The worst part, many captives were not enemies at all. The Aztecs bought children from poor families during famines. They raised orphans specifically for sacrifice. Sahagún describes markets where parents sold their own sons and daughters for the glory of the gods. One codex shows a father receiving 400 cacao beans for his 8-year-old boy, enough to feed the family for a year. The child was painted blue, given paper wings, and carried in procession as an image of the god Tezcatlipoca. He would live like a prince for a year, then have his heart cut out on the stone. And then there were the impersonators, the perfect human vessels. For the most important festivals, the Aztecs selected captives who looked exactly like the gods. For the festival of Tlaxcalan, they chose the most handsome young warrior without a single blemish. For a full year, he lived as Tezcatlipoca on earth. He was dressed in Quetzal feathers, gold bells on his ankles, given 4 beautiful wives, and paraded through the city while musicians played flutes. Everyone bowed to him. He ate the finest food. 20 days before the sacrifice, he was given new wives and taken on a tour of the lake cities. On the final day, he walked up the pyramid steps alone, breaking a flute. At each landing, at the top, the priests seized him, bent him over the stone, and 4 held his limbs, while the 5th plunged the obsidian blade into his chest. His heart was raised, still beating, to the sun. The body was carried down, not dragged, but carried with honor, and eaten by the nobility. Yes, eaten. The Aztecs practiced ritual cannibalism on a scale never seen before or since. The body of a captive was given back to the warrior who captured him. He hosted a feast for his relatives, cooking the limbs in maize stew. Eating the flesh of a brave enemy transferred his strength and courage. Refusing to eat was the ultimate insult to the gods. One Spanish soldier watched in horror as an Aztec noble offered him a piece of human thigh, saying politely, "Eat, my friend. This man was very brave. The scale is what should haunt you." At the dedication of the Great Pyramid in 48-7, the Aztecs sacrificed 20,000 people in 4 days. Spanish chroniclers who hated the Aztecs still wrote in disbelief. Andrés de Tapia counted 136,000 skulls on the main Tzompantli alone. Modern excavations under Mexico City have found skull towers, actual towers built from human heads mortared together, faces still staring out. One tower discovered in 2015 had over 650 skulls in just one section, including women and children. The mortar was mixed with blood. The Aztecs didn't hide it, they advertised it. Every major temple had at Tzompantli a wooden rack holding thousands of skulls, threaded through the temples with horizontal poles. When the wood rotted, they built stone towers instead. The main one in Tenochtitlan was described by Spanish soldier Bernal Díaz del Castillo as higher than a house and wider than a street, he wrote. "I stood looking at it and felt sick. The smell of blood and decay was unbearable. The skulls weren't old battle dead, they were fresh. Priests refreshed them constantly. The message to visiting ambassadors was simple: this is what happens if you fall behind on tribute, and the variety of rituals was endless. Each god demanded a different death. For the fire god Xuticutli, captives were thrown into massive bonfires, then hooked out still burning so their hearts could be cut, while the flames licked their skin. For the earth goddess Tlaxcalan, children were drowned in Lake Texcoco. Their tears were believed to bring rain. For Saipe Totec, the flayed one, victims were shot with arrows until they weakened, then skinned alive. The priests wore the skins like suits for 20 days until they rotted off, smelling of death to show the gods' power of renewal. The gladiatorial sacrifice was the cruelest theatre. Prime captives were tied to a stone disc with a short rope long enough to move, short enough to stay trapped. They were given feather-covered weapons with no obsidian edges. Against them 4 elite jaguar or eagle warriors with real blades. The fight was rigged. If the captive somehow won 4 fights, almost impossible, he was freed. Spanish sources record only 1 man ever achieving this. The rest were dispatched slowly, their blood painting the stone, while the crowd roared approval. The final blow was always the heart removal, still on the disc, still conscious. Children got no mercy. During the festival of Atlacawalco, children bought or captured were taken to a whirlpool in the lake and drowned, one by one. Their parents, often the ones who sold them, were forced to watch from boats. Sahagún's informant said the children were told it was a game, "We're going to see the green places under the water." Their bodies were retrieved and buried in fields to ensure fertility. Women had their own horrors. For the corn goddess festivals, young women were decapitated over a pile of maize. Their heads were carried on poles through the city, while their bodies were flayed. One ritual required a woman to dance all night with her captor, knowing that at dawn her head would be cut off and her skin worn by a priest who continued the dance. Another involved stretching women between 4 poles and shooting them with arrows until they resembled porcupines. A slow death offered to the god of spring. The priests were professionals. They trained for years in the Kamakak schools. The high priest wore a cloak made of human skin and hair matted with blood that never washed off. During major festivals, they didn't sleep for days. They covered themselves in black soot and blood, eyes wild from lack of rest and hallucinogenic mushrooms. They used special knives, obsidian so sharp it could cut a hair lengthwise. The technique was precise, one slash below the ribs, hand inside the chest, heart torn out upward toward the sun. The body had to stay upright long enough for the blood to cascade down the pyramid steps. Channels were carved specifically for this, and the empire ran on it. Every conquered city paid tribute in captives. The Codex Mendoza lists exact quotas. Texcoco owed 8,000 victims a year. Subject cities sent them in processions, painted and feathered, singing hymns as they walked to their deaths. Refusal meant total war. When the Aztecs crushed a rebellion, they didn't just kill, they annihilated. One city that revolted was sacrificed en masse, every man, woman, and child. The priests worked for weeks. The smell drifted for miles. Even the nobles sacrificed their own. Kings offered their own blood, daily piercing tongues, ears, and genitals with maggy thorns, pulling ropes of spikes through the wounds until they fainted. During coronations, the new Tlatoani had to capture dozens of victims personally. Moctezuma I was said to have sacrificed over 4,000 in one ceremony to prove his worth. His palace had private altars where he performed small sacrifices every morning before breakfast. The archaeology is undeniable. Under the Templo Mayor, excavators have found layer after layer of offerings, thousands of human hearts burned in ceramic bowls, skulls with cut marks, exactly matching the ritual descriptions. Children with their throats slit, women with obsidian blades still embedded in their spines. One stone box contained 45 children, sacrificed at the building's foundation, all under 7 years old, all showing signs of prolonged fattening. The smell of Tenochtitlan was blood. Spanish soldiers wrote that you could smell the city before you saw it. The lake water around the temple district was red. Vultures circled constantly, dogs fed on bodies thrown into the canals. When Cortés entered in 1519, he described the main temple as so covered in blood that the walls were black and the floor stank. The Aztecs believed every drop of blood paid a cosmic debt. The sun god, Huitzilopochtli, needed hearts to fight the darkness each night. If the sacrifices stopped, the world ended. This wasn't metaphor, it was policy. Moctezuma I declared that the empire's entire purpose was to feed the sun. Every war, every tribute, every child sold in the market traced back to the altar. The priests calculated exact numbers, 4,000 hearts for a minor festival, 20,000 for a coronation. When drought came, they doubled the quota. When enemies ran low, they invented new festivals. The captives knew the theology better than anyone. Many were raised in allied cities that shared the same gods. They understood they were dying so the maize would grow. Some went willingly. Sahagún recorded captives singing hymns as they climbed the steps, telling the priests, "Do it quickly, my fathers, so the sun rises tomorrow." Others fought. Spanish sources describe warriors biting priests, cursing in Nahuatl, trying to drag themselves off the stone, even after their chests were opened. One Tlaxcalan chief, brought for the dedication of the Great Pyramid, spat in the face of the high priest and shouted, "Kill me, but your gods will starve anyway." He was flayed alive over 3 days, his skin worn by the priest during the rest of the ceremony. The aftermath was as ritualized as the killing. After the heart was offered, the body slid down the steep steps designed so blood would flow in rivers. At the bottom, old women collected it in bowls to smear on temple walls. The skull was defleshed by specialists who threaded it onto the tzompantli the same day. The limbs went to the captor's family. The torso was thrown to the zoo animals in Moctezuma's palace. Jaguars, eagles, pumas, fed exclusively on human flesh. The emperor watched them eat from his throne, believing their strength came from the same divine source, and the empire expanded to feed the machine. By 1519, the Triple Alliance controlled an area the size of Italy, with 5 to 6 million subjects. Tribute rolls demanded not just feathers and cacao, but people. The province of Tupac owed 2,000 victims a year. When a city fell behind, Aztec armies arrived to collect in person. Rebellions were crushed with exemplary terror. The entire population of a town sacrificed in one marathon ceremony. One codex shows priests working in shifts, collapsing from exhaustion, new ones taking their place so the knives never stopped. Even allies lived in fear. Tlaxcalan, the Aztecs' great rival, practiced sacrifice too, but on a smaller scale. When Cortés arrived, the Tlaxcalans allied with him partly because they were tired of supplying thousands of their own warriors to Aztec altars. One Tlaxcalan noble told the Spaniards, "We fought them for 80 years, so our children would not end on their stones." The psychological warfare was deliberate. Aztec merchants Pochteca traveled disguised as traders to enemy cities, counting warriors, noting defenses, spreading stories of the great temple, resist, and every one of you will feed the sun. Ambassadors brought gifts, feathered shields, gold-lit plugs and warnings. Pay your debt in captives or pay in your own blood. The message worked. Most cities surrendered, rather than face the altar. The Spanish witnessed the peak. When Cortés entered Tenochtitlan, he was invited to the temple. Bernal Díaz wrote, "We climbed 114 steps, each slick with blood and flesh. At the top were 2 altars with idols so tall we could barely see their faces. The priests were black with soot and blood crusted in their hair. The stench was worse than a slaughterhouse." Cortés himself, no stranger to violence, was shaken. He later wrote to Charles V, "They sacrifice 20,000 men a year in this city alone and eat them." The archaeology keeps growing. In 2020, excavators found another Tzompantli section, 180 skulls, arranged in a circle. Many with holes drilled for poles. Many were women, contrary to earlier beliefs that only warriors were displayed. In 2022, a child sacrifice pit held 42 bodies, all with their chests opened the same way. DNA shows victims came from across the empire: Oaxaca, Veracruz, the Gulf Coast. The Aztecs imported suffering, the way Rome imported grain, and the priests never doubted. They kept detailed records in painted books, how many hearts per god, which festivals required flaying, which needed drowning. When the Spanish burned most codices, a few survived. The Codex Magerbeciano shows step-by-step illustrations, the captive on the stone, the knife entering, the heart held high, the body tumbling. The artist drew it with reverence. The empire's greatest festival was the new fire ceremony every 52 years. All fires in the empire were extinguished. People smashed their pottery, fasted, waited in darkness. If the priests failed to light the new fire on a chosen victim's chest, the world ended. In 115-7, the ceremony required a specially chosen captive, tall, strong, noble. He was kept drugged for days, so he wouldn't struggle. At midnight on the hill of Tlaxcalan, the fire priest could open his chest, place dry tinder inside the cavity, and spark the flame. If it caught, runners carried the fire to Tenochtitlan, where it lit the Great Pyramid. The empire breathed again for another 52 years of blood. The machine began to fail in ways no one predicted. By the early 1500s, the empire was running out of enemies willing to play the flower wars. Cities surrendered faster, paid tribute in goods instead of people, or allied secretly against the Aztecs. The priests noticed the altars were hungry. Moctezuma Dawei sent armies farther than ever into Maya lands, across deserts just to keep the supply flowing. When captives grew scarce, they turned inward. Nobles began sacrificing their own slaves in greater numbers. Commoners sold more children. One chronicle records a famine year when parents lined up at temples, offering their kids for a handful of maize. The psychological cracks appeared. Captives began resisting more. Spanish allies later told stories of warriors who refused the pampering, starved themselves in cages, or attacked their captors on the pyramid steps. One group of 14 Huastec captives in 1510 overpowered their guards at the top of the temple, killed 3 priests, and jumped to their deaths rather than give their hearts. The crowd went silent, the ultimate insult to the gods. Moctezuma ordered the bodies burned without ritual, but the damage was done. Whispers spread, the sun might not need these hearts after all. Even the priests showed strain. Sahagún's informants, elder Aztecs interviewed decades later, admitted some priests secretly doubted. One high priest confessed on his deathbed that he had faked heart offerings during lean years, using animal blood to stain the idols. Another stopped piercing his ears because the gods already had enough. The Calmecac schools began graduating fewer priests. Young nobles preferred military careers over the blood-soaked life. Then the omens came. In the 10 years before Cortés, Tenochtitlan saw catastrophe after catastrophe: comets, fires, a lake that boiled without wind, deformed babies born to noble women. Moctezuma consulted oracles who told him the age was ending. He doubled sacrifices, ordering 4,000 in a single month to calm the gods. The Tompantli grew so large it collapsed under its own weight. Skulls rolled into the streets, the smell drove even Aztecs from the sacred precinct. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, the system was already cracking. Cortés had only 500 men, but he had 200,000 Tlaxcalan allies who hated the altars more than they feared the strangers. When the Spanish saw the skull racks, many vomited. One soldier wrote, "We thought we had seen war, but this was hell itself." Cortés used it as propaganda, telling subject cities, "Join us and the sacrifices end forever." When the Aztecs trapped Cortés in the city, they sacrificed 70 Spanish prisoners on the Great Pyramid in full view of their trapped comrades. Bernal Díaz watched from a rooftop as his friends were dragged up the steps, hearts torn out, bodies rolled down. The priests wore their blonde hair as trophies. The drum of hearts never stopped, but it backfired. The remaining Spaniards fought like demons, and the allied cities flocked to Cortés in rage. In the 82-day siege of Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs sacrificed thousands of their own people trying to turn the tide. Priests worked day and night, bodies piling so high the steps became impassable. When the city finally fell on August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani, was captured alive. The Spanish found the temples ankle-deep in gore. One room held 100,000 skulls, stacked like firewood. The Spanish ended it with fire and pickaxes. They tore down the Templo Mayor stone by stone, using the blocks to build their cathedral on the exact spot. The great Tzompantli was smashed. Priests were hunted and executed. Sacrifice was made a capital crime. But the trauma lingered. Native chronicles written after the conquest speak of survivors waking screaming, tasting blood that wasn't there. Some secretly continued small offerings in caves for generations. Today, when you visit the Templo Mayor Museum in Mexico City, they show you beautiful jade masks and golden bells. They have a small section on sacrifice, clean diagrams, polite explanations about cosmic debt. They do not play the sound of 70,000 people chanting as a heart is raised. They do not let you smell the blood. But the stones remember. Under the cathedral, excavations keep finding more. Another skull tower in 2020. Another child pit in 2022. The earth beneath Mexico City is layered with hearts. Doinar shows victims from every corner of the empire. People marched hundreds of miles to die on that stone. The feathered headdresses in the museums were worn by the men who held the knives. The turquoise mosaics covered altars slick with blood. The beautiful city of canals and gardens floated on a lake stained red. This wasn't a dark chapter, it was the entire book. The Aztec Empire lasted 200 years by convincing millions that mass murder was the only way to keep the sun rising, and for 2 centuries it worked. If this is the first time you've seen the unfiltered machinery behind the pretty pyramids, drop Tenochtitlan in the comments and share this with someone who still thinks ancient civilizations were just colorful and spiritual, because the altar is gone, but the debt was never paid. And somewhere, beneath the streets of Mexico City, the stones are still wet. The earth itself is still giving evidence they tried to bury. Every decade, construction in Mexico City unearths more. In 2017, a hotel foundation dug up a section of the real Tzompantli AT skulls embedded in lime mortar. Many had the horizontal holes still visible, where poles once threaded them. The faces were turned outward, eyes gouged out centuries ago, so they could watch the city forever. Among them were women and at least 3 children. Their small teeth still perfect. The discovery made headlines for a week, then, quietly, disappeared from the news. The skulls were moved to storage, no museum display. Too disturbing for tourists. In 2022, Metro workers found another monolith. This one, a sacrificial stone, buried face down, under a colonial street. When they turned it over, the carving was still vivid. A captive, bent backward, priest above him, knife descending. The blood channels clogged with centuries of human ash. Tests showed the stone had been used for decades, layers of burned hearts fused into the grooves. But the most damning evidence came in 2020, when archaeologists finally excavated the chapel the Spanish built inside the ruined Templo Mayor to cleanse it. Beneath the altar, they found a sealed pit. 42 children, all aged 3 to 7, all sacrificed at the same time. Their tiny chests opened the Aztec way, their bodies arranged in a circle around a central post. Spanish priests had known it was there, they buried it deeper instead of reporting it. The Vatican archives still hold a 1578 letter from a bishop, admitting, "We covered the abomination so the natives would forget." The forgetting almost worked. For centuries the story was softened. Textbooks called it ritual sacrifice, and focused on the beautiful codices, the poetry, the astronomy. Museums displayed the sunstone and feathered shields under soft lighting. Tour guides spoke of spiritual offerings and cosmic balance. They rarely mentioned that the average Aztec citizen attended dozens of human sacrifices every year, that mothers brought children to watch, that the city's heartbeat was the drum on the pyramid, announcing another heart raised. Even the numbers were debated to make it palatable. Early Spanish estimates of 20 to 80,000 sacrifices a year were called exaggerations by 20th century scholars who wanted to defend indigenous culture. They argued the Aztecs couldn't possibly have killed that many. Then, the skulls started piling up. The Templo Maya project alone has catalogued over 10,000 human remains in 30 years of digging, and they've barely scratched the sacred precinct. DNA shows victims from as far as Honduras. The logistics were staggering. Captives marched in from across the empire. Bodies processed like an assembly line. The trauma echoes in modern Mexico. Indigenous elders in remote villages still tell stories of ancestors who survived the fall by hiding in caves, whispering that the gods were angry because the blood stopped. During Day of the Dead, some families leave empty plates on altars for the ones who never came home. In Tlaxcalan, old men spit when the Aztec eagle is mentioned. 500 years later, they remember who fed the altars. The Spanish didn't end the violence. They redirected it. They replaced the obsidian knife with the stake and the Inquisition. Thousands of natives burned for relapsing into old rituals, but the memory of the pyramid never died. When Emiliano Zapata rode into Mexico City in 1914, his soldiers pointed at the cathedral and said, "There's where the big temple was. Our blood paid for every stone." Today, the site is a UNESCO World Heritage Landmark. Tourists take selfies in front of reconstructed walls, buy miniature pyramids made of chocolate, listen to guides explain the sophisticated calendar system. Most never go down into the museum's lower levels where the real stones are kept. The sacrificial blades still flecked with iron from human blood, the child-sized offering vessels, the tsompantli fragments with teeth marks from vultures. The cathedral bells ring every hour over the exact spot where tens of thousands of hearts were torn out. The stones are still there. The blood channels filled with concrete now, but rainwater sometimes runs red after storms, iron oxide from centuries of gore leaching out of the ground. The beautiful city you see in postcards was built on a foundation of human chests, cracked open to keep a god alive. Every canal, every garden, every palace floated on blood debt. The empire fell, not because the gods abandoned it, but because the people finally refused to pay. And that refusal cost another river of blood, this time with guns and smallpox. But the altar is silent now. The sun still rises. No hearts required. If this exposed the machinery behind the myth they taught you in school, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're going to keep pulling back the curtain on the history they tried to whitewash. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next one. Because the pyramid may be ruins, but the debt was never imaginary, and the earth beneath Mexico City still remembers every name it swallowed.